So Roberts was what we called an FNG. That's an effing new guy. An effing new guy.
FNU guy,
FNGs.
yeah.
And everybody was an FNG until you acclimatized. And you literally took 3 weeks to become used to the heat. The average heat was 100 to 105 degrees. And then in the deep jungle, it would go up to 100. With the humidity, it would go up to 110, 115. And when Roberts joined our platoon, he was gung ho.
Mm.
He wanted to earn his medals. He wanted to get his kills. First thing he did was salute me, and I told him, "You are never to salute an officer." We wore no insignia. The only way you could tell I was an officer was on the band that ran around my helmet. It said LT Bartlett. We didn't even call each other by our names. My name was either LT, which stood for lieutenant, or 1-6. 1-6 being the first platoon leader, 6 being the leader. And everybody had nicknames, and that was good because as an officer, there were times when I had to put men in harm's way, and I couldn't be close to them. The only ones I even got remotely close to were my platoon sergeant, my radio operators, and my medic. That was my little command group. And I knew them pretty well. We huddled together in the same foxholes, but I could not afford to have a close relationship. And Roberts wouldn't listen. He wanted to get his kill. He went out on a patrol. I wouldn't make him the squad leader. He was justified in being a squad leader because he had the rank. But I would not allow him to take over as a squad leader until I felt like he was acclimatized and knew our protocols. And as I said, he went out on a patrol. I told him that the squad leader would be in charge. He was not in charge. He understood that. But when they got into a sniper attack, he stood up and charged, foolishly charged the enemy sniper, thinking that he could take him out. And he was killed. The bullet went right through his forehead.
Wow. Yeah, it's a pretty chilling story. I mean, I guess it is a lesson, right, to like assume your position properly and understand that, not let ego get into the way necessarily. Especially like you said, he was still, inexperienced in the field, right? I think he probably should have listened to your advice there.
I did 3 things in my platoon that I think allowed me to survive. As I mentioned before, a platoon leader had a 90-day survival rate, and I completed my tour. Now, I was wounded 2 times. Fortunately, not too severely. They were shrapnel wounds. But I did 3 things that I think helped me to survive my tour in the field. The first thing was I tried very, very hard not to do stupid stuff. Now, that may sound kind of silly, but it was very important. For example, I had a fellow officer who was with me in the 82nd Airborne Division, and we would bring in helicopters on a regular basis with hand signals because the pilot needed to be directed exactly where you wanted him to land. And so we had a protocol that was, various different hand signals and telling the helicopter pilot what to do. Very simple. But he stood on a mound to give these signals to the helicopter pilot. And when the pilot landed, the rotor blades took off his head.
Oh my God.
Oh my goodness.
So that's an example of being stupid. Secondly, when I joined my platoon, I sat down with my squad leaders and my platoon sergeant, and I said, you guys have more time in the field than I do, and I want you to tell me if you think I'm doing something wrong. I said, I'm still going to be the leader. You're not going to be in charge, but I want to hear what you have to say, and I want to listen to you, and I want to take advantage of your experience. And that kind of set the tone for the leadership within my unit. And then the third thing I did was I listened to my point man and the cover man. These are the two men who are most vulnerable to ambush and to being killed, because they're not only looking ahead, but they're looking down for booby traps, and it's a very nerve wracking situation. And occasionally they would have a bad feeling about what we were facing, and they would call me forward. And if you couldn't hear any birds chirping, if you didn't hear any monkeys screeching, or even if they had a kind of a sixth sense that something was wrong, I would shoot artillery. This was called reconnaissance by fire. So I would fire artillery in front of the position that we were going to be walking through. And I shot a lot of artillery. In fact, I shot so much artillery that the battery that supported us put a budget on me of 25 rounds. They said that's the most you can shoot for reconnaissance by fire. But when my men walked through this area that had been blasted by an artillery barrage, they felt a lot more comfortable, and they respected the fact that I was not putting them in harm's way.
Okay, you were taking extra precautions. Really, you were trying to be as safe as you could.
Well, and listening to the two men who were at the front who were most vulnerable.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
I
And
think
sometimes it was, believe me, sometimes it was just a sixth sense. They just had an uneasy feeling.
Yeah, I think you just kind of develop that by being in those environments. I imagine every little sound, sight movement can trigger, something in you where you feel that
yeah.
something
The
is
men who
lurking.
had the men who had hunted, back in the States, maybe hunted deer or whatever animals it might have been, they were better at being the point. But it had to be rotated among all the soldiers. There was no
Okay.
favoritism. Every man walked point at one point in time.
Okay. So everyone had that experience there. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, and I just want to say something that you mentioned earlier that I think is a skill that we should learn to develop just in life in general, right? And you mentioned that listening to, your superiors and just listening to any feedback that they might have. I think that's a really important skill to have just in general, right? Just to listen and understand that, you'll get better advice if you just stop talking and listen to the person that's talking to you, because you'll learn better that way.
Well, and my platoon sergeant was supposed to be the man in the unit with the most experience. Typically, a platoon sergeant has 8 to 10 years of military experience, but mine had gone through an instant NCO training program. NCO is a non-commissioned officer, and he came out of that course as a platoon sergeant, a sergeant E6, and he actually had his 19th birthday in Vietnam. So he and I had about the same level of experience. At 22, I was the second oldest man in my unit. We had one man who was 24. 90% of my soldiers were draftees, and the other 10% were had volunteered, volunteered to join the army. So
See.
90% of them were drafted, and 10% had volunteered.